April 18th, 1942. It was the day that stunned the Empire of Japan, the day that would reverberate through every high command meeting in Tokyo, the day that forced the most powerful military machine in the Pacific to rethink everything it believed about its own invincibility. It was the day 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the deck of the USS Hornet in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, something no one had ever attempted, something even American commanders weren't fully sure would work, roared toward Tokyo in an attack so daring, so improbable, so reckless that the Japanese leadership had not even imagined it as a possibility. And yet, it happened, the Doolittle raid. But to truly understand why this single strike, militarily small, strategically symbolic, tactically risky, forced Japan to rethink its entire strategy, we need to rewind to the months before it, to the moment when the United States reeled from the shock of Pearl Harbor. After December 7th, 1941, America had been plunged into darkness. Battleships burned, sailors were lost, and the Pacific Fleet lay crippled. Japan seemed unstoppable. One after another, territories fell: Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines. Everywhere, Japanese forces advanced with astonishing speed, conquering positions that had taken the West decades to secure. In Washington, morale plummeted. The public demanded revenge, demanded action, demanded proof that the United States was not broken. President Franklin D. Roosevelt felt this pressure more than anyone. He needed something dramatic, not a minor skirmish, not a defensive victory, but an attack that would strike at the heart of Japan itself. Yet the US military was unprepared. The Pacific Fleet was shattered. Aircraft carriers were the only ships capable of projecting power, but they were few in number and too valuable to risk in a direct attack on Japan. The Japanese Empire, believing itself untouchable, believed its home islands were safe behind thousands of miles of ocean. Impossible, their admiral said. America cannot strike us here. And so when someone proposed a wild idea launching medium bombers off the deck of an aircraft carrier, the idea sounded closer to a suicide mission than a military operation. Medium bombers were never designed to take off from carriers. They were too heavy, their wingspan too large, their flight characteristics too awkward, and worse, after bombing Tokyo, they wouldn't have enough fuel to return to the carrier. They would have to continue westward and attempt to land in China. It was madness, which is precisely why President Roosevelt approved it. To execute the idea, the US Navy needed a leader with daring vision, and they found the perfect man. Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle, a pilot, an engineer, a record-setting daredevil, a man whose name alone inspired confidence. Doolittle understood the risks, understood the stakes, understood that this mission might not only fail, but claim the lives of every volunteer who flew it, and yet when he asked for volunteers, every available pilot stepped forward. "Take me, sir," many said. "Let me hit back." The training began in secret. On windswept airfields, crews practiced the nearly impossible, lifting a B-25 off the ground in less than 500 feet, the length of an aircraft carrier S-deck. Mechanics stripped weight off every plane they could. Pilots trained to fly low, fast and precise, skimming the waves to avoid detection. Navigators memorized routes over open ocean without landmarks. The Navy calculated where the carriers would need to position themselves closer to Japan than they had ever dared approach. And still, the risks multiplied. The carriers had to travel without their full escort because they needed maximum speed. Submarines could find them, Japanese patrol boats could spot them, aircraft from Japan could attack them, and if that happened, the entire raid would collapse before it began, yet the men went anyway. On April 2, 1942, the carrier USS Hornet departed San Francisco with 16 B-25s, lashed to its deck, a sight no sailor had ever seen. When the planes were first rolled onto the carrier, the crew cheered. When the Hornet left port, crowds lined the shore to wave. No one knew where it was going or why it carried land-based bombers, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Something big was coming. As the Hornet crossed the Pacific, it met with the USS Enterprise, whose fighters would protect the mission until the bombers launched. Admiral William Bull Halsey, fierce, bold, and fearless, commanded the escort force. He knew the risks as well as anyone, but he also knew the country needed this. And so the task force pushed westward into waters crawling with Japanese patrol craft and submarines. They travelled in radio silence. Sailors kept binoculars glued to the horizon. Everyone knew that if they were discovered, the mission could end in disaster. On April 18th, well ahead of schedule, the task force encountered a Japanese picket boat, the worst possible outcome. Alarms blared, crews scrambled, Doolittle and Halsey exchanged quick, grim glances, They had been spotted. They could not risk the carriers. The bombers would have to launch immediately nearly 200 miles farther from Japan than planned. The crews might not have enough fuel to reach safety in China. They might have to ditch in the ocean or crash land in enemy territory, but there was no turning back. The decision had been made. The mission would go forward. With waves crashing over the deck, the first B-25 positioned itself at the edge of the carrier. Pilots' hearts pounded. Sailors held their breath. Engines roared against the wind. The deck pitched in the heavy seas. Go! The bomber lunged forward. Tires screamed. The plane bounced once, twice, then lifted off the deck, climbing into the stormy air. A miracle. One after another, the 15 remaining B-25s launched successfully, something aviation experts had said was impossible. The sailors on the Hornet cheered wildly, raising fists to the sky, and as the last bomber disappeared over the horizon, Halsey turned the carrier group around and raced away at flank speed. The raiders were now alone. Over the Pacific, Doolittle and his men flew low, skimming the waves to avoid radar. Hours passed. The sky cleared. Japan's coastline rose into view, the one sight Japanese military leaders believed they would never see through the eyes of an enemy aircraft. Then the moment came that would shake the empire to its core. Sirens wailed across Tokyo. Anti-aircraft batteries scrambled. Soldiers looked upward in disbelief. American bombers were approaching the capital. At 12:15 p.m., bombs fell on Tokyo. Explosions tore through military factories, dockyards, oil tanks, and warehouses. Fires erupted. Civilians rushed into the streets. Japanese officers ran to telephones, screaming orders in confusion. Nearly every major city, Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, came under attack. The psychological shock was enormous. For decades, Japanese leaders had proclaimed the homeland invulnerable. Their people believed it. Their military believed it. Their emperor believed it. But now, in broad daylight, American bombers soared over Japan's sacred cities. The myth was shattered in seconds, and in that moment, that very moment, Japan's entire war strategy trembled. But the raid wasn't over. The bombers now had to escape, and fuel was running out fast. Doolittle's men pressed on toward China as the daylight faded, flying into worsening weather. One by one, nearly every bomber ran out of fuel. Crews bailed out or crash-landed, some into rice paddies, some into mountains, some into coastal waters. Many were rescued by Chinese civilians. Several were captured by Japanese forces. Doolittle himself parachuted into a rice field, unsure if the mission had succeeded or failed. But back in Tokyo, and later across Japan, panic spread like wildfire. How did the Americans reach us? Where did those bombers come from? How could our defenses fail? Japan had been humiliated not by the damage, which was minor, but by the psychological blow. The impossible had happened, and that shock, more than anything else, forced the Imperial Japanese leadership to rethink everything. This was the attack that changed Japan's trajectory, and the raid had only just begun to reshape the war. April 18th, 1942. The sun had barely risen over the Pacific when 16 B-25 bombers lifted off the deck of the USS Hornet, their engines roaring like a swarm of awakened giants, and it was in that moment those impossible takeoffs from a carrier deck, built for much smaller aircraft, that Japan's military future quietly shifted without the leadership realizing it yet. As the bombers climbed low over the waves, skimming the water like metal shadows, the Japanese high command still believed their fleet remained untouchable, and their homeland invulnerable, convinced that no American aircraft could ever reach the Japanese mainland. They believed distance alone was a shield, the vast ocean an impenetrable wall. But the Doolittle Raiders' 80 men in 16 aircraft were about to shatter that illusion forever. What made the situation even stranger was that this mission wasn't designed to inflict major physical damage. The bombs the Raiders carried were few, the targets limited, the fuel dangerously restricted. It wasn't about destruction, it was about message, symbolism, psychological shock. And as Jimmy Doolittle's lead bomber crossed the horizon toward Tokyo, he understood that they weren't flying just for America. They were flying for every soldier retreating in the Philippines, every civilian grieving Pearl Harbor, every nation believing the Axis powers were unstoppable. Yet as these bombers soared toward Japan, a storm of consequences was building unseen, because this mission, small as it seemed, would trigger a reaction far larger than anyone on the Hornet could have predicted. The Japanese military had built its entire strategic worldview on the assumption that the homeland was sacred ground, unreachable by enemy fire. Their defensive posture reflected this arrogance. Fighter units were positioned far from the cities, Radar networks were incomplete and inconsistent, and anti-aircraft crews were never trained for the possibility of American bombers over Tokyo itself. Even as the B-25s closed in, Japanese commanders dismissed early sightings or warnings they simply didn't believe the Americans could be coming. And then, just after noon, the sound of unfamiliar engines echoed above Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, Nagoya, and Osaka. Civilians looked up in confusion. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled, startled, uncertain, and as the Doolittle Raiders dropped their bombs on factories, oil tanks, docks, military targets. The physical damage was limited compared to later raids, but the psychological damage was incalculable. Fire and shock rippled through Japan's proud capital, and for the first time in the war, air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo. Smoke curled into the sky. Explosions echoed through neighborhoods untouched since the 1923 earthquake. People fled into the streets, staring at a sight they had been assured could never happen: American bombers flying unchallenged over the imperial capital. The Japanese high command was stunned, furious, humiliated. To them, this was just an attack. It was an unthinkable violation of everything their military had promised to protect. And because the Japanese war machine had been built so heavily on pride and perception, the leadership reacted emotionally, not rationally. In the hours after the attack, Japanese leaders began arguing over how such a breach could have happened, how American planes could have reached the mainland, and their responses were soon drenched in anger rather than strategy. They immediately ordered massive shifts in resources, redeploying fighter groups, reorganizing fleets, expanding homeland defenses, but these moves, far from strengthening their position, began unraveling their carefully constructed Pacific plans. In Tokyo, senior generals argued that the Doolittle raid was merely a scouting operation for a much larger American invasion force. Others insisted that the carriers responsible must be destroyed at all costs. The result was an emergency, aggressive strategic pivot. Japan's navy, previously preparing a long-term expansion into the Indian Ocean and finishing operations in Southeast Asia, abruptly shifted its focus back toward defending the home islands. Aircraft carriers were redirected, battleships repositioned, air patrol patterns rewritten. What none of them understood yet was that this chaotic response, fueled by wounded pride, would lead them straight into disaster at Midway weeks later. Meanwhile, the Doolittle Raiders, having dropped their bombs, faced their own life-or-death struggle. Because they had been forced to launch early after encountering Japanese picket boats, their fuel reserves were dangerously low. Every minute they spent in the air pushed them closer to impossibility. Doolittle himself knew their chances of reaching the safety of China were shrinking by the second. As night fell, the bombers reached the coast through storms, low clouds, and failing engines. One by one they ditched off China-esque shores, crash-landed in rice fields, bailed out over mountains, or in one case landed in Soviet territory. The mission technically should have been a tragedy, but instead it became legend. Chinese civilians and resistance fighters risked everything to rescue the downed Americans. Entire villages helped them flee from Japanese patrols. And because Japan was already enraged by the raid, the Imperial Army retaliated savagely across parts of China, committing atrocities that historians still mourn today. The Doolittle raid didn't just shake Tokyo, it shook Japan's military psychology. And that shockwave radiated outward, destabilizing their leadership's sense of invincibility. Back in Washington, Roosevelt received the coded message, "The mission has been accomplished." The American public, still reeling from Pearl Harbor and months of defeat, erupted in celebration. For the first time in the war, America felt momentum, felt agency, and Japan felt violated, vulnerable, uncertain. Japanese strategists gathered in emergency meetings, trying to deduce where the American carriers had come from and how they had struck the homeland. They were furious that their intelligence networks had failed. They cursed their air defense officers, they blamed radar crews, coast watchers, and fleet commanders. Pride trumped pragmatism. As the days passed, the psychological shock intensified. Japanese leadership concluded that they could never again allow the Americans to strike the homeland, and the only way to guarantee that was to extend their defenses far into the Pacific. This led them to target Midway, a tiny island whose value was suddenly magnified in their eyes. They needed a buffer zone, a barrier stretching thousands of miles. They needed to lure the American fleet into a decisive battle, and so the Doolittle raid, which began as a small symbolic strike, became the catalyst for the Battle of Midway. Japan completely rewrote its naval strategy because of 16 bombers that barely dented Tokyo's infrastructure but devastated its strategic confidence. But in the immediate hours after the raid, Japan's panic was palpable. Civilians lined up in shelters, anti-aircraft crews manned positions day and night, planes patrolled constantly. Newspapers downplayed the attack, yet rumors spread across the country that American fleets were already closing in. The Japanese people, who had been told for years that their nation was untouchable, were suddenly forced to confront a terrifying new reality. And the leadership, horrified by the psychological fracture, doubled down not on strategy, but on emotion. They responded with brutality in China, paranoia at home, and increasingly reckless military decisions. Meanwhile, the United States analysed every reaction Japan made. Intelligence officers noticed Japan's radio traffic spike. They noticed carrier groups shifting. They noticed fear replacing methodical planning, and Roosevelt realised the raid had achieved more than morale, it had destabilised the enemy's mind. In the days following the attack, Doolittle believed he would be court-martialed for losing all 16 aircraft. Instead, Roosevelt promoted him. The nation hailed the raiders as heroes, and across the Pacific, Japan began tightening its defences, stretching itself thin, making decisions that would lead directly to its greatest naval defeat. The Doolittle raid had done what Pearl Harbor had done for Japan, shocked a sleeping giant awake. Only this time, the shock forced Japan into mistakes it couldn't recover from. This mission, small in bombs but enormous in consequence, had forced the Japanese High Command to rethink everything it believed to be true about the war, about American capability, and about their own vulnerability. And Churchill, Roosevelt, and military planners across the Allies recognized something profound. Japan's aura of invincibility had cracked, and once a crack forms even in an empire that seems unbreakable, it never stops widening. June 4th, 1942. Afternoon. The horizon over the Pacific was still thick with rising smoke, burning oil and the scattered wreckage of aircraft when the Japanese fleet realized that the battle they believed would secure their dominance had instead turned into a disaster, unfolding with a speed and violence they could scarcely comprehend, and as the shockwaves of the morning's devastation rippled through the decks of the carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Once the pride of the Imperial Navy but now raging infernos melting into the sea, Japan's commanders found themselves staring into a new and terrifying reality. Their enemy had not only anticipated their movements, but had outmaneuvered them in a way that was as strategic as it was humiliating. It was an attack that should not have been possible, an attack that contradicted every principle of naval warfare they believed they had mastered, an attack that forced them to rethink not just their tactics, but the very foundations of their strategy, doctrine, and worldview. For years, Japan had dominated the Pacific through speed, coordination, and the aggressiveness of its carrier strike groups. At Pearl Harbor, they struck first and decisively. In the East Indies, they swept aside Western colonial fleets like driftwood. They advanced across the Pacific with an air of inevitability. Even the Battle of the Coral Sea, though tactically inconclusive, had failed to shake their confidence. But Midway was different. Midway was catastrophic. As the afternoon sun glared down on the surviving ships of the Japanese First Air Fleet, the humiliation became impossible to ignore. The Akagi, pride of the carrier force, lay crippled, fires cascading down her decks like rivers of molten metal. The Kaga-S hangar decks erupted in explosions every few minutes as fuel lines ignited and torpedoes cooked off like volcanic eruptions. The Soryu was a charred skeleton, and all around them drifted the debris of aircraft, bodies, and shattered dreams. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stared in disbelief at the destruction, his hands trembling despite his attempt to hide it from his staff. This was the man who had commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor, the architect of Japan, as greatest triumph now forced to confront his greatest failure. The bitter truth he could no longer deny was this: the Americans had known. They had known everything. The attack on Midway had been orchestrated with a knowledge of Japanese movements so precise that it seemed supernatural, but it was not unknown to Nagumo, to Yamamoto, to the entire Imperial Navy. The Americans had cracked JN-25, the Japanese naval code. Every message, every tactical instruction, every strategic plan, every carefully concealed maneuver had been silently intercepted and deciphered. The Japanese had walked into a trap and now they were paying the price. But the shock did not end with the loss of 3 carriers. The Japanese commanders were only beginning to understand what this attack meant. Japan had always believed its pilots, its ships, and its naval doctrine were inherently superior to those of the United States. Their entire war plan relied on delivering a single, decisive blow that would shatter American morale and cripple US naval power. But now, in a single morning, it was Japan that had been struck by a decisive blow, one so devastating that its implications cascaded far beyond the battlefield. As the afternoon wore on, The cries of wounded sailors echoed across the decks of the remaining carriers. Thousands were dead or dying. The heat from the burning ships was so intense that rescue boats could barely approach. On the Akagi, crewmen jumped into the water, their uniforms smoking, their skin blistered by fire. Others refused to abandon ship, clinging to the rails, unwilling to leave the symbol of Japan's naval pride. Officers shouted orders through clouds of choking smoke, trying to salvage what they could, but it was futile. Every minute the situation worsened. But the shock that hit Japanese leadership went beyond the physical destruction they could see. In the command centers, staff officers stared at maps and realized that their entire strategic assumption, the belief that the United States was too slow, too inexperienced, too disorganized to react effectively, had been a fatal miscalculation. The Americans had not only reacted, they had reacted with precision. They had launched their aircraft at the perfect moment. They had anticipated Japanese movements with uncanny timing, and worst of all, they had shown a willingness to risk everything. The Japanese had believed American pilots lacked the courage to press attacks against superior air defenses, yet the Morning S assault showed American pilots diving through anti-aircraft fire, wingmen being blown apart mid-descent, entire squadrons wiped out, and still they kept coming. The sacrifice was brutal, staggering, but effective. It was this relentless determination, this refusal to retreat even in the face of near-certain death, that had cracked open the window for the dive bombers that ultimately sealed Japan's fate. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, the emotional impact was profound. Yamamoto had never believed Japan could win a long war against the United States. He had warned political leaders that attacking America was a gamble that could only succeed through a rapid, overwhelming victory. Pearl Harbor had given Japan hope. Midway shattered it. As Yamamoto received fragmentary reports, carrier decks destroyed, flight crews lost, entire air groups wiped out, he felt a sinking dread, unlike anything he had experienced in his long naval career. This was not a setback. This was not a bad day. This was a turning point the moment he realized Japan's war strategy, built on momentum and early victories, had just been broken. And yet, even as the Japanese fleet reeled from the morning attacks, an even greater shock awaited them. At 5:30 p.m., as the surviving Japanese commanders struggled to organize counterattacks, word came that the last operational Japanese carrier, the Hiryu Valiant, determined, fighting alone, had itself been found and attacked by American dive bombers. A final rain of explosives tore through her decks. Flames erupted, munitions detonated. The Hiryu, once a symbol of Japanese resilience, now burned like the others. This was the moment the magnitude of the disaster became undeniable. All 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were gone. 4 carriers, 4 air groups, 4 pillars of Japan's naval strategy destroyed in a single day. No one in the Imperial Navy had ever imagined such a possibility. As sunset approached, the Japanese fleet limped away from Midway, their mission aborted, their morale crushed. Nagumo stared at the sea in silence, unable to comprehend the speed with which everything had unraveled. Officers spoke in hushed voices, afraid to acknowledge what they all knew. Japan had suffered the greatest naval defeat in its history. More than that, Japan had lost the ability to conduct offensive operations on this scale ever again. But the attack's impact stretched far deeper than ships lost or planes destroyed. Inside the Japanese Navy's command circles, fear began to spread, not fear of the Americans, but fear of what Midway revealed. If the Americans could anticipate Midway, what else could they anticipate? How many Japanese messages had been intercepted? How long had the Americans been reading their communications? Could any plan be trusted? Could any assumption be safe? The psychological blow was massive. For years, Japan's military leaders had cultivated an aura of invincibility. They believed their pilots were superior, their training unmatched, their tactics flawless. Midway forced them to confront the truth. The Americans were not only capable, they were fast learners, and worse, they were now fighting with a confidence Japan could no longer match. That night, as the fires of the dying carriers lit the black waters of the Pacific, Japanese sailors gathered on the decks of their surviving ships and whispered the unthinkable. If we lost 4 carriers today, what will we fight with tomorrow? And in Tokyo, when news reached military headquarters, senior officers went pale. The press was told nothing. The emperor was informed privately. The truth was too devastating to share with the nation. Japan had not simply lost a battle, it had lost its strategic initiative. From that moment forward, Japan would fight not to conquer the Pacific, but to hold on to what it had already taken. Midway forced Japan to rethink everything: its confidence, its doctrine, its code security, its entire approach to naval warfare. And as the dying glow of the burning carriers faded into the night, the Japanese commanders knew something else with chilling certainty. The war had changed forever. And now, for the first time, Japan was on the defensive. June 6, 1942. The sun rose over the Pacific on the final morning of the Battle of Midway, like a spotlight revealing the shattered remains of Japan's once invincible naval dream, and as the surviving aircraft limped back toward their carriers, some smoking, some leaking fuel, some piloted by men who could barely keep their eyes open, Japan's admirals began to understand the scale of the disaster unfolding beneath them, a disaster not simply of ships and planes, but of ideas, assumptions, and the very foundations of their war strategy. In the early hours, the Japanese commanders still clung to hope that at least one of their carriers might be salvageable, that the flames roaring across their decks would die down before reaching the fuel lines, that the explosions tearing through their hangars could be contained. But as hour after hour passed, reality drowned hope in fire and smoke. Akagi, Kaiga, and Soryu, 3 of the 4 proud carriers that had crushed Pearl Harbor, overrun Southeast Asia, and hammered the Indian Ocean, were now burning funeral pyres in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, their flight decks twisted and melted, their hangars turned into infernos, their crews desperately hurling bombs and torpedoes into the sea to prevent further explosions. The once calm Japanese command, so confident in its timetable, so accustomed to victory, was now reduced to stunned silence. The radios crackled with frantic reports, fires uncontrolled steering compromised abandoning ship. The bridge officers could barely comprehend what they were hearing. These carriers had been symbols of Japanese naval supremacy, floating temples of imperial power, and now, one after another, they were turning into flaming ruins. And yet, the full blow had not even fallen. As the morning wore on, the Japanese realized the 4th carrier, Hiryu, their last hope, their last striking arm, was desperately hunting the American fleet, trying to land the knockout punch that might salvage something from the catastrophe. Hiryu's pilots launched attack after attack with the fury of samurai making a final charge, and for a few fleeting hours they struck back, severely damaging the USS Yorktown and briefly giving Japan a surge of hope, but fate was already against them. American scouting planes found Hiryu, isolated and vulnerable, and within moments 3 waves of dive bombers descended upon her like avenging spirits. The bombs struck with terrifying precision, igniting her deck, rupturing her fuel lines and sending flames roaring through her hangars. By the afternoon, Hiryu was mortally wounded, her captain issuing orders for crew to abandon ship as the fire consumed everything aboard. And in that moment, Japan's proud Kido Butai, the 1st Air Fleet, the greatest carrier force ever assembled, the same force that had attacked Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific with unstoppable momentum, ceased to exist. 4 carriers destroyed, hundreds of planes lost, thousands of veteran pilots gone, men who could never be replaced. Japan had not just suffered a defeat, it had suffered the greatest naval loss in its history. But what shook the Japanese commanders more deeply than the flames or the explosions was the realization that everything they believed about American weakness had been wrong. For months, Japanese intelligence had preached the same narrative. America was too soft, too divided, too inexperienced to face the Imperial Navy in open battle. American pilots were clumsy amateurs, American officers were hesitant and unimaginative, American morale was weak. But at Midway, every one of these assumptions shattered. The Americans had read their communications. The Americans had anticipated their strategy. The Americans had outmaneuvered them, outplanned them, and most painfully out-sacrificed them, sending waves of torpedo squadrons in suicidal attacks that disrupted Japanese operations long enough for the American dive bombers to strike the fatal blow. Japan had always believed its pilots were unmatched, and to be fair, they were elite, hardened, devastatingly skilled. But the Americans showed a willingness to fight that Japan had not expected, a willingness to lose everything in order to win everything. The Japanese admirals, their faces drawn, their eyes hollow, replayed the battle in their minds as the remaining ships limped home under cover of night. They saw the moment they hesitated, waiting to rearm their bombers. They saw the fatal indecision as they debated whether to prepare for ship-killing torpedoes or island-killing bombs. They saw their flight decks cluttered with fueled planes, their hangars stacked with explosives, their crews scrambling in panic as the American dive bombers appeared overhead like demons summoned from the clouds. It wasn't just luck, it wasn't just surprise, It was a structural failure, a flaw in Japanese doctrine. They realized their strategy required perfection, timing perfect, coordination perfect, intelligence perfect, and Midway exposed the danger of that requirement. Japanese decisions were centralized. American decisions were flexible. Japanese carriers kept all armed planes on deck simultaneously. American carriers cycled their planes in smaller groups. Japanese commanders believed in the decisive battle doctrine: win one giant battle, win the war. But at Midway, that doctrine became a trap. By putting all 4 carriers in one place, they lost everything in a single afternoon. And when the smoke cleared, it became painfully clear that Japan's pilot training program had no way to replace the combat veterans who died in the flames. These weren't just men lost, they were expertise lost, experience lost, the irreplaceable heart of Japan's naval aviation. Meanwhile, America had an industrial machine that could build new carriers faster than Japan could repair them, and a training program that could produce hundreds of new pilots per month. As the Japanese fleet turned for home, the officers understood that the balance of power had shifted forever, and then came the report that sealed Japan's realization of its new reality. The Americans had lost only one carrier, Yorktown, and they had saved most of her crew. One carrier for 4, one ship for an entire fleet, one day's battle for the future of the Pacific. In the days that followed, Japanese newspapers published sanitized reports, speaking of glorious sacrifice and temporary setbacks. But every naval officer in the Imperial staff knew the truth. Japan had lost its offensive arm. Never again would the Imperial Navy mount a large-scale carrier assault. Never again would they dominate the seas uncontested. Never again would they have air superiority in the Pacific. Midway had forced a brutal reckoning. Japan realized it could no longer rely on aggressive expansion. It could no longer count on surprise. It could no longer trust in the myth of invincibility that had fueled its early victories. Instead, Japan was now forced into a defensive war, one it had no economic strength to fight. The empire that had stretched from Burma to the Aleutians now had to be protected on thousands of miles of coastline, a task that no nation, not even Japan, could manage with a crippled navy. And their worst fear was also becoming reality. America was coming. Midway didn't just stop Japan, it opened the door for the Americans to strike back. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the momentum of the war shifted permanently. The samurai empire had been cut deeply, its pride wounded, its strategy exposed as fragile. Officers aboard the surviving ships stared into the waves, asking themselves the same question: how could they have underestimated the Americans so completely? The answer, though they never admitted it publicly, was simple. They had assumed superiority instead of proving it. They had believed victory was destiny rather than discipline. They had believed boldness was strategy rather than risk. And so, as the fleet sailed back toward Japan, carrying the wounded, the shell-shocked, the survivors who had watched their carriers burn, Japan understood that the war ahead would be long, brutal, and unwinnable. Midway was not just an attack. It was not just a battle. It was the moment Japan was forced to rethink its entire strategy from offense to defense, from expansion to desperation, from confidence to survival. And for the rest of the war, every Japanese commander, every pilot, every sailor fought with the knowledge that Pearl Harbor had been their beginning, but Midway was the beginning of their end.